just knock the mic. Okay.
So, you can actually reach yours with
yeah,
your
there you
head.
go. So I am still Josh,
I am still currently Danny.
as far as we know.
Last time I
But
checked.
for some of you that follow him on social media, he does go by a different name, which is interesting. I don't know
That's
why.
the whole podcast topic
Where-
itself.
Where did Don go? That's okay.
Oh no, he's still here.
He
it's
is
it's
still
more of
here.
where he came from that matters
Okay.
most.
Okay. So, I know many people are wanting to know that, but we'll save that for another, maybe a blooper reel or something. I don't know.
Like a Q&A one of
Yeah,
these days.
Q&A one of these times. Like, what does this mean?
Yeah.
But this week we want to talk about what's growing on. Play on words there, okay? But we
Nice.
want to just talk through as we mature in faith, as we grow in our relationship with God, there's things that get planted. There's seeds that get thrown out onto our soil, right? The soil of our lives. And stuff starts to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we recognize in our life when something starts growing that maybe shouldn't be there? How do we recognize, how do we know that it shouldn't be there? And really addressing some of those things before they take root. Because once something takes root, it can be more difficult and more problematic if you pull something out that has a lot of roots. You can really disrupt the soil, and it can be, corrupted there. But as stuff is growing, my wife kind of gave this example, and that's what we're kind of talking back and forth a little bit of, she was planting some stuff in her garden, and there were good seeds and bad seeds that were planted, but they were kind of growing at about the same speed, and they even looked really similar. She couldn't really tell looking at them at first glance, like, okay, which is a weed and which is the seed.
Yeah.
So in our walk with God, how do we decipher, like, oh, this is a good thing, I need to let this grow, I need to protect this, and then, oh, this is a weed and I should pull this out right away. So off the bat, what do you think there? Like, how do you identify the good things that are growing in your life, and how do you identify the bad things, like, oh, I need to pull that out?
Right. I think so. With that analogy that you said Anna was using, it's kind of, if I was to continue with that, I would say, okay, what fruit do they bear? Obviously. Now, ideally, you would get it before it gets to that point.
Sure.
Because that's, like you said, once it's bearing fruit, that means it's taken root, and it's going to be more difficult. And it's a difficult thing in that I kind of think of it like this. Again, just kind of going with an analogy you've set in place. Both of those plants, as similar as they look, came from somewhere. So one, you intentionally planted, or someone intentionally planted, maybe in your family, with the hope and the purpose of bearing a certain kind of fruit, a good fruit, right? And now from somewhere else, we don't know where, it could have been, accidental, it could have been purposeful, like we don't know, maybe, a kid planted it there unknowingly. This other thing is now there. So you kind of have to look at the source. Now that's kind of where, for me, the analogy drops off. I'm not going to dig it up and compare the seeds.
Badoonch.
Yeah. But with that, it's like, okay, when you're evaluating something in your life, it's like if someone instills a certain moral in you, right? Growing up, like I was taught not to steal. I look at that. Okay, where does that come from? Well, it came from my dad, it came from my mom, but where did it come from for them? It came from their parents, and so on and so forth, and the Bible ultimately, right?
Yeah. So that seed is constantly being thrown out.
Exactly. And also with that, it's like looking at the history too. Like, okay, this must be true. Anyway, so we know it comes from the Bible. Now, something else I might hear, maybe it's from a TV show. We like to talk about, like, the follow your heart thing, right? With that, okay, where does that come from? It doesn't come from the Bible. Nowhere in the Bible does it say follow your heart. So where does it come from? Okay, it comes from humanity, humans, more specifically. Within that, where do we hear that? We hear it in secular TV shows, songs, celebrities like to use it. So right off the bat now, we're like, okay, doesn't really have a lot of substance to it. Doesn't really have any history besides, Taylor Swift said it, so it's got to be true, right? Like, you know what I mean? And so I think you can pretty quickly discern whether something's probably not good.
Yeah.
If it's not coming from, like, a viable source. It's like when you buy something off the internet, you want to make sure it's a good site before you put your credit card in.
Yeah.
Kind of like that in a
Yeah.
way.
Yep.
Maybe use your trust pilot, go on there, and if everyone's like, nah, it's scamming you, probably don't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that. Just that how we filter through what needs to be protected and allowed to continue to grow versus what needs to be pulled out and uprooted before it becomes a big major problem. Because again, at the infancy stage of some of this stuff growing in your life, okay, yeah, not stealing, for example. That's a good thing, right? Like, as a small child, you're not going to be stealing bubble gum. Like, you're going to, pay for it, and you're going to, you see the candy bar and you're going to buy it, right? Because you realize early on that, okay, if you don't and you just take it, mom and dad find out, you get a little bit embarrassed.
Pull off his leather belt.
Yeah. Well, maybe not that extreme, but maybe.
I don't know.
For me, I remember when I tried that out and I had to go back and pay for it, and it was super embarrassing.
Yeah.
But it was like, okay, that needed to grow a little deeper and take root, because I needed to know, like, okay, restitution, making things right, not doing that anymore. That was important. But then your other example of, follow your heart, it's like, okay, so on the front end, like when that seed's first thrown out there, it seems harmless.
Yeah.
It seems kind of like, oh no, that's great. Like, listen to what you're thinking.
Just feel good. You feel good.
And some people might even say, well, God put that there, and God gave you this. Yes, that's true. But if you
also have
we have a sinful nature, and if you follow that too far and you allow that to grow even deeper, now all of a sudden, well, I'm following my heart, and it's my will, and it's my decision, and it's you get engulfed with a really selfish seed that starts growing into something that you're like, oh, that's a bad blackberry bush that isn't bearing any berries. Like, it's and then it can be too late.
Right.
Because if you see some of these vines that entangle and grow so fast,
it starts taking over.
It's a cute little blackberry bush, one day, and then the next day it's like, right, just swallowing up a tree, or
took out everything.
Everything in its path,
just everywhere.
And I think that's a good example of that. Follow your heart seed, where it
full of good analogies.
It starts out subtle and it chokes you out. So the example a lot of you guys are probably familiar with is the parable of the sower, and that's found in Matthew 13. I wanted to kind of read through that a little bit, because I think that kind of touches on some other scenarios where seed might get thrown out, and the condition of your soil, I guess. So Matthew 13, a farmer, and this is Jesus talking, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly, but because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came out, the plants were scorched and they withered, because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop 100, 60, or 30 times what was originally sown. He who has ears, let him hear. And Jesus goes into describing it and talking about how that's the secrets in the kingdom of heaven, and because his disciples were kind of confused with that. But if we look at what Jesus said, if we look at what he was describing there, I think in some ways it's a call to make sure that our soil is in good condition, and that we are allowing good things to grow, and that we're not getting too chaotic with things that are going on, with things that are attaching to us, and that we're aware of, this is a blackberry bush, this shouldn't be growing, or this is a rose, this is beautiful, but I need to prune some things back, and addressing things before they grow into this monstrosity. And I think that's kind of the main thing, where a lot of times we'll talk about things like bearing fruit and doing other stuff. That's something that's full grown. That's something that's really rooted and grounded in God's word and has found good soil. What I'm kind of wanting to go after a little bit today, and we can talk about it a little bit more, but just how do we find those things that are tiny, that look harmless, that look innocent on the front end, but they're, if allowed to grow, that seed is going to be pretty bad. You know, one important piece which Jesus talks about there is the soil of our hearts. But the other thing is recognizing what seed is being thrown out and who's throwing it. Like you were talking about your parents throwing that seed of truth, where it's like, hey, stealing is bad. Stealing is bad. Stealing is bad, right? Those things get reinforced and it grows as you get older, and you start realizing, like, okay, what is stealing? Well, what, you know, as you let that conviction sink in, you're like, okay, I need to not do this. I need to do this. This is right. This is wrong. So yeah, what do you think?
Well, so initially, one thing I do want to ask in a second here, if you maybe give an example of like one of these little things you're talking about, because I think that'll kind of help me a little bit to figure out how I go about it. But then also, you went back to the whole like the parents throwing the seed, recognizing the seed. With that, you have to be, and as you get older, you know, you begin to question things for yourself, and really you believe what you believe because you understand why you believe it, right? And so with that, like, yeah, my parents have taught me pretty much all the good morals that I have. That being said, there's also been some things that they say sometimes that I don't actually agree with. And like sometimes, like my dad has said things that I don't, I'm like, I see why you think that. I don't. And here's why. And with that, like, you have to question the source sometimes.
Sure.
And now, obviously, I went through a phase where that was the Bible. Like, I had to question that because I couldn't believe it unless I questioned it. That's just how I am. But then I did, and then I believed it all the more, right? And so that turned out to be a good thing. And so in the same way as to recognize the seed, you have to understand that, hey, humans aren't perfect. Like, my parents are really good, and I'm blessed to have them, but they're not perfect. I'm not perfect. So between both our not perfectness, something's going to happen. Something's going to be said that wasn't intended, and you have to be able to discern that. But yeah, do you have an example?
Yeah. So lying, for example, it can start out maybe as something that you're like, oh, this isn't that bad, or well, it's
like a little fib.
Yeah, a little fib, or a little white lie, or a little something where you're like, it's not that big of a deal, or well, it's kind of true. If we start justifying that and let that grow, it can become into full-blown deception. It can come into full-blown deceit or malicious lying or habitual lying where you just can't tell the truth, even if the truth is staring you right in the face. And so, but addressing that when it's really tiny and in a much weaker state where it's like, that's not true. And, you know, I don't know.
I think initially, so you know how you mentioned in the parable how it's addressing the soil that it's being thrown into. So if you have a good soil that's being thrown into, right? If you've been raised with good morals, maybe you understand at least the basics of the Bible, then I think that's a plenty good foundation to start with as a young adult. And something like lying, what stood out to me was when you said if you justify it. I think if you have to justify it, that's a tell right there where it's like where you're in your mind, you're like, yeah, no, it wasn't that bad, like it's fine. That's not you wouldn't have to do with that with something that was fully true that you knew to be true. And so if you find yourself doing that, and I know I've found myself doing that plenty of times, it's like, is there a way that I would feel better about doing this? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, I said this, but ultimately, who is it helping? Why is it helping? And so I think if you have to justify it, probably take a step back.
Yeah, and so there's lots of things that can get. By no means are we doing an extensive list of things, but with a lot of people, sometimes their morality or their morality, their sexuality, their ethics, or I guess I should say our way of thinking, like when I allow something in to grow that isn't rooted or based in the Word of God, it might not seem like a big deal at first, but once it starts growing, it can become something that's far more toxic and far more negative in my life than I might have originally anticipated. And so it's far easier for me in that situation, if I'm being real and honest and humble, and surround myself with other people that are good gardeners and recognize something as it's growing, and allowing people to come in and be like, hey, that's a bad attitude. You got to pull that out. Well, what's the big deal, man? I was having a bad day. Well, okay, if you let that grow, your bad day now will all of a sudden become justified, and you will start thinking, oh, well, stuff revolves around me. Well, now all of a sudden that plant starts to take over the rest of your garden, and you don't think about other people. You don't think about what matters most. You don't think about how you're coming across, or how you're treating people, or how you're representing, God. And it started from just a tiny little, not that big of a deal. And I just think that these things are more important than they might seem on the front end. And I'm not advocating like being super paranoid and going around and like, oh, all these little issues and just nitpicking things. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we got to recognize some of this stuff is more important than we think. Mm-hmm. Some of this stuff, it's not just a lie. It's not just a second glance. It's not just a little thing here, a little thing there. Like if you give in and say, oh, well, it's okay to look again, or it's okay to lust. It's okay. It's not that big of a deal. I'm not hurting anybody, whatever. That will become something that you regret, that you don't like. And this is guys and girls I'm speaking to here. It can turn into something far worse and far more difficult to uproot if you don't address it when it's in a tinier form, where it's whatever. No, don't. Just don't.
You're hurting yourself.
There are situations where I straight up won't wear sunglasses because I'm like, no, I want to maintain that integrity, and I want to fight for that. I would rather be squinting and be uncomfortable because the sun's in my eyes than have sunglasses on to where there's no accountability for where my eyes go. And that's just a small practical thing that I do, where it's like, if I know I'm in a situation like that, I'm going to physically put myself in a spot where I am physically uncomfortable so that I can be accountable, so that it's not going to lead to something where I don't want to go. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing where a lot of stuff, when we don't address things when it's smaller, is we get led places where we don't want to go. We say things we don't really mean. We do things we don't really want to do, but it's because we let those small, seemingly insignificant seeds start to grow. And all of a sudden, like, wow, that is not even remotely true. Well, it's because you allowed yourself to lie when you were little, and you thought, oh, it's not a big deal. It's not hurting anybody, right? Or stealing, or, whatever. You throw out whatever it is, and if it doesn't get addressed and pulled out through Scripture and through people that love you, that's where we can kind of start getting some of these bigger problems that, it's not impossible. God can still uproot and change and transform. And I mean, God's an amazing gardener. So no blackberry bush is so deep that God can't pull it out. Like that's, hallelujah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Nobody's too far gone with that kind of stuff. And that's great news for everybody listening. Like everything like that, like God can redeem and forgive and restore and just do beautiful things with each and every one of our lives if we let him. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of the big thing that we got to focus on at the end of all this is, what's growing, what's developing, what's going on. And we got to figure out like how to protect those things, how to guard those things, and how to not let the things that are going to take from those nutrients, the things that are going to distract or pull away or destroy what God's been growing, because God's the one that grows it. God's the one that waters it. God's the one that is responsible for cultivating that soil, for watering the soil, for in a lot of ways in planting the seeds and everything like that. And that we have to, our part in that is being faithful, being excited, being aware, being invested in what's growing, and being accountable to that too. Mm-hmm. It's like, hey, if I let that continue to grow, if I let that go, and it's not a big deal. Oh, it's just a little whatever. It's like it can take over the whole garden, take over the whole thing, and become way more work. Again, not impossible, but way more work to where it would have been far easier if you are hearing this and you're like, oh man, okay, I'm convicted about this, or oh man, I need to change this. It's far easier to go in and pull out that one little, punk weed than wait and be like, it's not that big of a deal. And all of a sudden you're 16, 17, 18, 50, and you've got this garden that's overrun with this weed that you didn't address. You didn't think, oh well, what's the big deal? It's just it's just how I respond. It's just how I talk. It's just how I whatever. Like, there are people, and I know, and it's sad. You see people like this where it's like, okay, their garden has been overrun with their language. There are people that I know and I love and respect. They can't help but swear.
Yeah.
They can't stop because they started at such a young age. It's part of their vocabulary. It's part of how they express themselves. They're not able to stop. It's going to take a lot of work to get them to stop, and it can be embarrassing. I don't think anybody's going to hell, right? If you swear, I don't think it's like, but it does frame you in a certain light. It does put you in a certain light where people might not take you as serious. If you would have addressed that at a small age, or if you would have had somebody that loved you and said, hey man, don't talk like that. Use this word, talk about this, like get more creative with what you're trying to describe. That's where, okay, you pull that out, and that can become a good thing. But we also have to put ourselves and trust other people that, like, hey, this person isn't just trying to ruin my garden. They're actually trying to help. And looking to other fellow gardeners, so to speak, with that kind of stuff to recognize.
Like going back to kind of in the beginning, how, for example, like I mentioned, questioning things when you believe it. Because, that you have to start there, because once you do that, now, okay, you have those trusted sources that you can go off of, that you can then allow to come into your life and to help correct you. And then, like you were saying, I wanted to talk about briefly, like you said you use sunglasses for that situation. I think recognizing...
Or don't use sunglasses.
Don't. Sorry. Recognizing, though, in your life, like, what are certain things that you're maybe more prone to, because we all have like for example, just stereotyping guys, like we all mostly kind of that's something that's you, especially at a young age, like that when that first happens, if you don't understand what it is, and then, okay, how can I help prevent this, but like not even just in that, but in so many things in your life, understanding what you're more susceptible to, and okay, now how, like, what can I do to help that. It's like when you have a health condition, like you take certain steps to prevent it from maybe
I'm allergic to that, I shouldn't eat it.
Like hello. So I like that.
Cool.
That was a good one.
Good. So what matters most in this is that we are aware, and we're focused on, and we care about what's growing, and that we don't think that, like, oh, I'll address this later, or oh well, whatever. And also that we're keeping tabs on the condition of our soil. Like, is our life set up in such a way that good things can grow, that good things will be recognized and protected? Are we in healthy communities where people are encouraging that to grow? And some of this stuff takes time. Some of this stuff takes patience and perseverance, long suffering, and you got to really make sure that you create a healthy shelter to where that can grow and develop. Because if you're constantly in a situation where you're being, ridiculed or mocked or teased, and your faith isn't able to take root and be built up, that's going to be really difficult. And so being proactive with that is, finding people that bring out the best in you, finding people that want the best for you, and finding people that when they don't know or they're confused or whatever, they're going to the Bible. They're not giving you their opinion. We got so many opinions, and opinions only go so far. Like, okay, that's what you think. That's great. What does the Bible say? What does God say? What is actually set up to change and transform my life? My opinions, my thoughts, my ideas, they will stop at a certain point. They might be good. They might be somewhat productive. I don't know. I mean, hopefully they help.
Depends what they're based on.
It depends on what they're based on, and that's the key. That's exactly it. Is what is it based on? So we love you guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. Danny, do you got anything else you want to add, or Any gardening tips or?
So our garden has just absolutely gone to crap this year, and that's mainly because we just didn't do anything.
Oh no, I think it's because you planted a bunch of kale,
Oh yeah.
right? What's the best way to harvest kale?
So what I personally like to do is you get it like, it's kind of expensive, but I would get about a gallon of gas. You just dump it all over and throw a match on it. That's the best way. Beyond that, it's not really worth it.
Gardening tips with Danny.
With
Thank
kale
you.
specifically.
Yep, kale. He's a kale specialist.
Yeah, I specialize.
All right. Thanks, guys.
See you next week.
Are you focused?
I think so. I mean, the little things on your face.
I just followed yours.